Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a deep dive into David Hume's aesthetic theory, and we're really tailoring this one for, fellow philosophers out there.
Yeah, it's really fascinating from a philosophical perspective because you've got to remember, Hume was writing before aesthetics was really solidified as its own field.
Yeah, like way before Kant and all that.
Exactly. We're talking like the genesis of these ideas. Hume grappling with beauty and judgment in a world where aesthetics as we know it was just emerging.
So no easy answers here, huh? We're getting down to the nitty-gritty, the raw stuff.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners will appreciate this, but just for some quick context, Hume was heavily influenced by thinkers like Addison, Hutcheson, Shaftesbury. You can almost trace the lineage of these concepts back to them.
Right, like they set the stage.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets kind of weird, right? Because Hume didn't just write about beauty when it came to art. A lot of his ideas about beauty come from his work on moral philosophy.
That's a great point, and it might surprise some people.
Yeah, it's like, are you saying me judging a good person is the same as judging like a good painting? I mean, that seems kind of far out.
Well, not exactly the same, but Hume saw a deep connection. He believed that how we feel shapes our values across the board in all areas of life. So how we emotionally respond to beauty, whether it's in a person's actions or a piece of art, it comes from the same place.
Okay, so emotions are key here. And Hume uses all these specific terms like taste, approbation, sentiment, but it all basically comes down to our feelings, right?
Right. It's all about how we feel.
But then if beauty is just a feeling, doesn't that mean it's all relative? Like anything goes?
Ooh, that's the big question, isn't it? And Hume definitely acknowledges that tastes vary. Like you and I might totally disagree about a particular painting, but he argues that not all judgments are created equal.
So it's not just everyone's opinion is equally valid.
Right. Some tastes are, for lack of a better word, more refined than others. And it's not because of logic or reason, but because of the quality of the feeling itself.
So, like, is he saying there's a hierarchy of feelings? My wow at a sunset is somehow better than someone's meh.
It's not so much a hierarchy, but more like expertise. Think of it like someone who spent years studying wine. They've developed a more sophisticated palate, right? They can discern subtle nuances that others might miss.
Right, their taste is more informed.
Exactly. And Hume would say the same thing applies to aesthetic emotions. Someone who's deeply engaged with art, studied it, experienced it, they have a more refined palate for those feelings.
Okay, I'm starting to get it.
Good,
Right.
because this leads us to one of Hume's most radical ideas, that beauty isn't actually a property of the object itself, but a feeling in the person experiencing it.
Yeah, he's basically saying beauty is in the eye of the beholder,
It
right?
is. It's like we see the color red, but the redness itself isn't out there in the world. It's happening in our minds.
That's like a good analogy.
And it's a real challenge for us as philosophers, because if beauty is subjective, how can we ever say something is truly beautiful objectively?
Yeah, some people try to get around this with what they call a dispositional analysis. They say beauty isn't the feeling itself, but the potential of an object to cause that feeling.
That's one way to look at it.
So is beauty just lying dormant in the object, waiting to be activated by a viewer? Or is it actually created in that moment of experience? It's a tough one.
It really is. And Hume doesn't make it easy for us. But one thing's for sure, even if beauty is subjective, it's not a simple cause and effect. It's not just object equals feeling.
Right, because we all bring our own stuff to the experience, right? Our own baggage.
Precisely. And Hume argues that our imagination plays a huge role in all of this. Our imagination colors everything we see with learned associations, the context we're in, even the usefulness of the object, whether real or perceived. We even factor in how we think other people would feel.
So, like, I walk into a cathedral, and it's not just the arches and the stained glass I'm seeing. It's also all these ideas about history and religion, and maybe even the awe that other people have felt in that space.
You got it. And all of that, according to Hume, is part of your aesthetic experience.
Wow, so it's a lot more complex than I initially thought. But this raises a big question. If it's all so subjective and filtered through our imagination, how can some judgments be better than others?
And that, my friend, is the central question of Hume's famous essay of the standard of taste.
Ooh, yeah, the standard of taste. Everyone always talks about that one. So how does he answer that question? Is there like a universal rule book for good taste?
Well, not exactly a rule book, but Hume argues for what we might call a wisdom of the crowd approach. He says that over time, the joint verdict of true critics emerges as the standard.
Okay, hold on a second. Who gets to be a true critic? Is there like a critic certification program I missed out on?
Huh. I wish it were that simple. But Hume actually lays out 5 specific criteria for what makes a true critic. They need refined senses, delicate sentiment, broad experience with art, the ability to compare works, and this is key freedom from prejudice.
So basically, you need to be like a superhuman art sensing machine. That's a tall order.
It is, and it raises some tricky philosophical questions like, isn't this whole thing circular? Do we need ideal critics to define good taste? But how do we find those ideal critics without already knowing what good taste is?
Yeah, it makes my head spin a little.
And to make things even more complicated, Hume acknowledges that even the most ideal critics can disagree sometimes. He calls these blameless preferences.
So even with all those criteria, there's still room for individual taste.
Exactly. Which leaves us with a very human puzzle. Is there any hope for a universal standard of taste? He leaves us wrestling with that one.
Classic Hume, right? Always leaving us with more questions than answers.
He definitely wants us to think for ourselves. But let's take this a step further. If Hume is so focused on feeling, how does he explain our enjoyment of art that makes us feel bad feelings? Like, why do we love tragedies so much?
That's a really good point. It seems counterintuitive. Why would we seek out art that makes us sad or scared or anxious?
I know, right? But Hume does address this, and his explanation is fascinating. He calls it a conversion process.
A conversion. What does that mean?
He's saying that the dominant pleasure we get from the art itself, from the skill of the artist or the beauty of the language, it kind of overrides those subordinate negative feelings.
So even though the story might be sad, we can still appreciate how well it's told, how beautifully it's crafted.
You got it. And Hume gets really specific about this. He talks about why we get more pleasure from a skillfully written tragedy than from, say, witnessing a real-life tragedy.
So it's not just about the content, it's about how it's presented.
Exactly. And Hume even picks apart those examples, showing us the limits of his own theory.
It's kind of cool that he's willing to scrutinize his own ideas like that. Not a lot of thinkers do that.
I know, right? But it still leaves us with that question. Is his conversion explanation enough to account for our love of tragedy?
That's a good question, and it's something for us to ponder as philosophers. Are there weaknesses in his argument? What other explanations might there be?
And maybe even more broadly, does this idea of conversion apply to how we enjoy things like horror movies or true crime today?
That's interesting.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. There's so much to unpack here.
Yeah, and we're just getting started.
Yeah, it's like we're drawn to these dark emotions, even in our entertainment.
It's true. It's like, what does that tell us about ourselves? But, going back to Hume, this whole discussion about beauty and taste, it's not just some abstract philosophy game for him.
Right.
He really believes it has real-world consequences for how we understand art, how we experience it, and even how we interact with each other.
So it's not just about, like, being a snob and saying, oh, this painting is objectively better than that one.
No, not at all. Hume's theory really highlights how personal aesthetic judgments are. Our individual experiences, our emotional responses, those really matter. There's no one right answer about what's beautiful.
But if it's all so subjective, how do we even talk about art? Doesn't that just lead to chaos? Like everyone shouting their own opinions with no common ground?
Well, for one thing, it encourages a certain humility, right? Like
Right.
recognizing that our own perspective isn't the only one.
Right.
But Hume also believes there's a shared human capacity for appreciating beauty, even if we disagree on the specifics.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we argue about art, we share our experiences, we get excited about the same things sometimes. So there must be some underlying principles of taste, even if we can't perfectly define them.
Exactly. It's this fascinating interplay between the subjective and the universal. And it makes me wonder, if taste can be refined, how do we actually do that? Is there a way to develop a more discerning eye, a deeper appreciation?
Yeah, that's what I want to know. Like, how do I level up my taste? Does Hume give us a roadmap or something?
Well, he definitely gives us some clues. He really stresses the importance of experience, of exposing yourself to a wide range of art, seeing different things, hearing different things.
So like more museum visits, more time reading poetry, really listening to music, not just having it on in the background.
Exactly. But it goes beyond passive consumption. Hume talks a lot about comparison, actively engaging with the art by comparing different pieces, noticing what works, what doesn't, why you prefer one over the other.
Oh, so it's not enough to just be like, oh, I love this or I hate this. You have to really dig into the why.
Right. It's about developing that critical eye, that ability to make nuanced judgments, and maybe most importantly, being open to new experiences, challenging your own assumptions, getting outside your comfort zone.
So constantly pushing yourself, always learning.
Exactly. That's how taste evolves. And it makes me think, if we can refine our taste in art, can we also refine our sense of morality?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Like, could becoming a better art critic somehow make you a better person?
Well, remember, for Hume, aesthetics and morality are intertwined. They both stem from our emotional responses.
So maybe by learning to appreciate subtle beauty in art, you're also training yourself to recognize subtle goodness in people, or to be more aware of those tricky ethical dilemmas.
That's the idea. It's almost like Hume is saying that engaging with art is a form of moral education.
Wow, that's pretty profound. And it makes me wonder what kind of art might be most helpful for this moral development. Does tragedy, with all its exploration of suffering and difficult choices, offer unique insights? Or is it beauty in its more uplifting forms that has a stronger power to inspire us?
That's a great question, and one we could probably spend a whole other episode discussing.
Definitely. But for now, I think we've given our listeners a good foundation in the core of Hume's aesthetics.
Mm.
And we've raised some really interesting philosophical questions along the way.
And that's what it's all about.
Right. It wouldn't be a Hume discussion without those lingering questions.
Yeah.
But I feel like we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore.
Oh, there definitely is. But what I find so exciting about Hume's aesthetics is that it pushes us beyond the traditional boundaries of art theory.
Yeah, it's not just about paintings and sculptures and classical music, right?
Yeah. Right. It's about how we understand any kind of value judgment, whether it's ethics or politics, or even our everyday choices.
It's like he's giving us a framework for understanding how our feelings, our gut reactions, shape our entire worldview. It's
Exactly.
like you're saying all those gut feelings we have, they really matter.
They do. It's not just like fluffy stuff,
Mhm.
it's fundamental to how we experience the world, especially when it comes to art.
Yeah, and as philosophers, I think that's a really important point. Hume is pushing us to move beyond these purely rational, like systems of value and acknowledge the role of emotions.
Absolutely. And it's through that acknowledgement that we can start to understand, like, the real complexity of human judgment, all the little nuances of taste, the fact that there are so many different valid perspectives.
Yeah, so different from those like rigid rules some people try to impose on art, the whole this is good and this is bad thing.
Yeah, totally. Hume's approach is so much more, I don't know, fluid, it's dynamic, it recognizes that beauty is subjective, but also wants us to understand where those individual perceptions come from.
So it's like this constant conversation between how we respond personally
Hmm.
and those broader standards of taste that we kind of all share, right? Always changing, always evolving.
Exactly. And that openness, that willingness to evolve, it's crucial, I think, because Hume's telling us that taste can be cultivated, it can be refined, it can be expanded. It's not something you're just born with, it's a capacity you develop.
So it's not enough to just say, I like what I like. You've got to be curious. You've got to explore. You've got to really think about why you respond to things the way you do.
Absolutely. It's about pushing yourself, having those thoughtful conversations, challenging your own assumptions and constantly striving to deepen your understanding.
And I love this idea that this whole journey, it's not just about becoming some expert art critic. It's about becoming, I don't know, a more well-rounded person, a more complete person, someone who's more in tune with the world around them.
That's beautifully put. I think that's really the core of what Hume is getting at. It's not just a theory of art, it's a theory of life, an invitation to really embrace the richness of experience, even with all the messiness and subjectivity.
And to really feel it all, not just observe it from a distance.
Exactly. That's the key, I think. Beauty is not something to be passively consumed. It's something to be sought out, wrestled with, engaged with, and ultimately deeply felt.
I love that. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Hume's aesthetics.
It's been a real pleasure discussing this.
Me too. And as always, we encourage you to keep diving deep, keep questioning, keep seeking out beauty in unexpected places. Until next time.